This happened 2 years ago, during the summer before my senior year of high school. I was 17 then, living in the Catskill region of New York with my family. The area was perfect for someone like me who craved outdoor adventures, endless mountain ranges, winding hiking paths, and nature preserves that seemed to stretch on forever. Our suburban neighborhood sat right on the edge of wilderness, making it easy to disappear into the woods whenever I needed to escape. My friend Dylan was the lucky one among our group. His family had just moved into this incredible house that backed directly into the Catskill Nature Preserve. The property was something out of a magazine, a sprawling stone patio with an in-ground pool and hot tub, surrounded by perfectly manicured landscaping. But what made it truly special was what lay beyond the back fence, a professional fire pit area that connected to a well-maintained trail system leading deep into the mountains. Dylan's parents had struck gold with this purchase, and we all knew it. The house became our unofficial headquarters that summer, the launching point for countless adventures into the wilderness that stretched endlessly behind his backyard. Our friend group consisted of 4 core members: myself, Dylan, Trevor, and our newest addition, Camden. Camden had moved to the area just 3 months earlier, and while he integrated well into our group, he hadn't yet experienced what we considered our ultimate test of courage, a nighttime hike up the mountain trail. The trail itself was deceptively simple during daylight hours. After 5 minutes of walking through dense forest, you'd emerge into a breathtaking meadow filled with waist-high grass that swayed hypnotically in the breeze. The elevated field offered stunning views of the surrounding valley, with golden sunlight filtering through the trees and creating an almost magical atmosphere. Beyond the meadow, the trail continued to an abandoned railroad track that cut straight through the mountain. Crossing those tracks opened up access to the steeper, more challenging mountain path that led to our favorite lookout point. During the day, this hike was pure joy. At night, it transformed into something entirely different. The same peaceful meadow became an exposed danger zone where anything could be watching from the tree line. The railroad tracks, so picturesque in sunlight, turned into an eerie corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions, disappearing into absolute darkness. The mountain trail itself became a gauntlet of shadows and strange sounds, where every snapping twig could signal potential danger. We'd done night hikes before, but always as a complete group. Camden had only experienced the trail during daylight hours, hiking with us on lazy afternoon adventures when the biggest concern was sunburn. Now, as the summer progressed, we decided it was time for his initiation. The plan was simple: he would lead us up the mountain path at night, proving he had the courage and outdoor skills to be a true member of our tight-knit group. The afternoon leading up to that fateful night had been perfect. We'd spent hours at Dylan's pool, enjoying the freedom that came with his parents being away for the weekend. A group of girls from school had joined us for most of the day, but as evening approached, we'd made it clear this would be a guys-only adventure. By 10 o'clock, we were alone, sitting around the fire pit as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The anticipation was building. Camden seemed nervous but excited, constantly asking questions about the trail difficulty and what to expect. Dylan assured him it would be fine, explaining how we'd done this hike dozens of times and knew every rock, root, and turn by heart. Trevor joked that the hardest part would be not laughing when Camden inevitably jumped at every shadow and sound. But as we gathered our supplies and prepared for the hike, I felt something I couldn't quite identify. The air seemed heavier than usual, and the familiar sounds of the forest had taken on an ominous quality. The crickets seemed louder, more aggressive. The wind through the trees carried an unusual chill despite the warm summer evening. Even the fire seemed to burn differently, casting shadows that moved in ways that made me uncomfortable. Looking back now, I wonder if some part of me sensed what was coming. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just teenage paranoia, but something felt wrong about that night from the very beginning. Unfortunately, excitement and peer pressure overrode any caution I might have felt. We were 17-year-old boys convinced of our own invincibility, about to venture into darkness with no understanding of what waited for us in those woods. By 11 o'clock, we had gathered everything we thought we'd need: heavy-duty flashlights with extra batteries, pocket knives, backpacks with water and snacks, and Dylan's father's emergency whistle in case we got separated. The gear felt reassuring in the bright lights of the house, but as we stepped through the back gate and onto the trail, everything took on a different weight. The familiar became foreign, and the comfortable became threatening. The initial section of the trail was narrow, forcing us to walk single file with Camden in the lead. The beam of his flashlight created a cone of visibility that extended maybe 15 feet ahead, beyond which everything disappeared into absolute blackness. The trees seemed to press in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate it. Every step we took seemed amplified in the silence, our footfalls echoing off the trees and creating a rhythm that sounded almost like pursuit. Camden was trying to project confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept sweeping his flashlight back and forth nervously. Behind him, Dylan offered encouragement and direction, pointing out familiar landmarks that were now barely visible in the darkness. Trevor brought up the rear, occasionally making jokes to lighten the mood, but even his usual humor seemed forced. The forest at night was alive in ways that daylight never revealed. Strange rustling sounds came from the underbrush on both sides of the trail, accompanied by distant calls from nocturnal animals we couldn't identify. Branches creaked overhead without any wind to move them. Leaves scattered across the path as if disturbed by invisible feet. The temperature seemed to drop with each step we took deeper into the woods, and I found myself pulling my jacket tighter despite the summer warmth we'd left behind at the house. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, we reached the edge of the meadow. During the day, this transition was always dramatic and beautiful, stepping from forest shade into brilliant sunlight and expansive views. At night, it was terrifying. The meadow stretched out before us like a vast black ocean, with the tall grass creating waves of movement that could hide anything. The openness that felt so freeing during daylight now felt dangerously exposed. The moon was visible but partially obscured by clouds, providing just enough light to create confusing shadows and shapes throughout the field. The grass moved constantly, responding to wind currents we couldn't feel, creating the illusion of things moving through it. Every few seconds, a particularly strong gust would cause an entire section to bend and sway, looking exactly like something large pushing through it toward us. Camden stopped at the meadow's edge, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the darkness ahead. "How do we know where to go?" he asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Dylan pointed toward the far side of the field, where the continuation of the trail was marked by a gap in the trees. It looked impossibly distant, and the path across the meadow was little more than a slightly worn track through the grass. We began crossing the field in a tight group, no longer maintaining the single-file formation. The exposed feeling was overwhelming. We were visible from any direction, with nowhere to hide if something went wrong. The grass on either side of the narrow path was tall enough to conceal a person, and it moved constantly, creating false alarms every few steps. My imagination began conjuring threats behind every shadow, and I found myself turning frequently to check our surroundings. Halfway across the meadow, we heard our first unexplained sound. It was a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from somewhere in the grass to our right. We all stopped immediately, flashlights pointed toward the sound, but the beams revealed nothing except swaying vegetation. The noise lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped abruptly. We stood frozen, straining to hear any follow-up, but the meadow had returned to its normal symphony of wind and rustling grass. "Probably just a deer," Dylan whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. We resumed walking, but the pace had quickened noticeably. The remaining distance to the far tree line seemed to take forever, with each step feeling more urgent than the last. By the time we reached the continuation of the trail, we were all breathing heavily and constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest on the far side of the meadow felt different from what we'd left behind. The trees were older and larger, creating an even denser canopy that blocked out what little moonlight had been available in the field. The trail here was less maintained, with more obstacles to navigate and less clear direction. Camden continued to lead, but his progress had slowed considerably as he carefully picked his way around fallen logs and protruding roots. The section of trail leading to the railroad tracks was the most challenging part of the hike, even during daylight. The path wound steadily upward through increasingly dense forest, with several creek crossings and a notorious patch of thorn bushes that had to be navigated carefully. At night, these obstacles became genuine hazards that required constant attention and teamwork to overcome safely. The thorn bushes were particularly treacherous in the darkness. What looked like a simple detour during the day became a complex puzzle of finding openings between the thorny branches while maintaining our footing on uneven ground. We had to move through one at a time, with the person in front calling back warnings about particularly dangerous spots. My jacket got caught several times, and I could feel thorns scraping against my legs despite wearing thick jeans. Camden was struggling with the terrain, occasionally stumbling or getting momentarily disoriented when his flashlight beam didn't reveal enough detail to navigate safely. Dylan stayed close behind him, offering guidance and encouragement, but I could sense growing frustration in both of them. Trevor and I followed, trying to keep spirits up with occasional comments, but the oppressive atmosphere of the forest was making casual conversation increasingly difficult. The sounds around us had changed as we climbed higher. The familiar cricket chorus had faded, replaced by more mysterious noises, occasional snapping branches, rustling that seemed too purposeful to be wind-driven, and distant calls that might have been owls but sounded somehow wrong. Our own noise seemed amplified in the forest, with every footstep, every whispered comment, every rustle of clothing echoing back from the trees in ways that made it sound like we were being followed. About 20 minutes into this section of the hike, we encountered the rocky hill that led up to the railroad tracks. During the day, this was a fun scramble over boulders and through crevices. At night, it became a dangerous climb that required complete focus and careful placement of every hand and foot. The rocks were damp from evening dew, making them slippery and unpredictable. Camden's flashlight could only illuminate one small section at a time, forcing us to climb largely by feel. I was third in the climbing order, following behind Dylan, when I heard Camden give a sharp intake of breath above us. "There's something up here," he said, his voice tight with tension. Dylan immediately climbed faster to reach him, and I could hear urgent whispered conversation above me. Trevor, still at the bottom of the rock face, called up asking what was happening. "Just some weird marks in the dirt," Dylan called back down, but his tone suggested he was more concerned than he was letting on. When I reached the top of the rocks and emerged onto the railroad right-of-way, I saw what had caught Camden's attention. The gravel between the rails was disturbed in a pattern that looked almost like footprints, but they were wrong somehow, too long, with spacing that didn't match normal human stride patterns. The railroad tracks themselves stretched away in both directions, disappearing into complete darkness beyond the range of our flashlights. During daylight hours, you could see for miles in both directions, with the tracks following the natural contours of the mountain ridge. At night, they created a corridor of absolute blackness that seemed to swallow our light beams. The silence here was different too, heavier and more complete, as if the tracks absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. We gathered on the gravel bed between the rails, ostensibly to rest before tackling the final ascent to the lookout point, but really because none of us wanted to admit how unsettled we were becoming. The railroad had always been one of our favorite parts of the hike, a dramatic transition point where civilization's remnants met pure wilderness. Tonight, it felt ominous and unwelcoming. Camden kept his flashlight beam trained on the disturbed gravel, clearly bothered by what he'd found. "Those don't look like normal footprints," he said, stating what we were all thinking. Dylan knelt down to examine them more closely, but the shifting gravel made it impossible to determine exactly what had created the marks. They could have been animal tracks, or the result of maintenance workers, or just natural settling of the railroad bed. But they could also have been something else entirely. Trevor suggested we continue to the lookout point and worry about the tracks on our way back down. It was a reasonable proposal, and staying on schedule would get us back to the safety of Dylan's house sooner. But as we prepared to cross the tracks and enter the final section of trail, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with fear. The disturbed gravel wasn't just random scuffing. There was a clear pattern leading from where we stood toward the mountain trail entrance. Whatever had made those marks had been heading in the same direction we were planning to go, and the tracks looked recent. The final section of trail to the lookout point was typically our favorite part of the entire hike. The path was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through beautiful forests with several scenic overlooks along the way. The climb was challenging but not difficult, and the anticipation of reaching our destination usually made the time pass quickly. Tonight, everything felt different. The moment we crossed the railroad tracks and entered the mountain trail proper, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The forest here felt older and wilder, with massive trees that must have been growing for centuries. Their trunks were so large that our flashlight beams couldn't illuminate their full circumference, creating the impression that we were walking through a grove of living pillars that disappeared into the darkness above our heads. Camden had settled into a steady rhythm leading our group, but I could see the strain was beginning to show. His flashlight beam wavered more frequently, and he was breathing harder than a moderate climb warranted. Dylan continued offering encouragement and navigation tips, but his own nervousness was becoming apparent in the way he kept checking over his shoulder and sweeping his light from side to side. The trail here followed a series of switchbacks that took us steadily higher up the mountain face. Each turn revealed a new section of forest, but also eliminated our view of where we'd just been. The effect was disorienting, making it impossible to maintain a sense of direction or distance traveled. What should have been a familiar route became a maze of similar-looking trees and shadows. About 15 minutes into the climb, we began hearing sounds that couldn't be easily explained. They started as occasional snapping branches somewhere in the forest around us, but the sounds seemed to follow our progress up the mountain. Whenever we stopped to listen, the noises stopped too. When we resumed hiking, they resumed as well, maintaining a consistent distance that suggested they were pacing us rather than coinciding with our movement by chance. Trevor was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Is something following us?" he whispered during one of our listening stops. The question hung in the air, unanswered because none of us wanted to confirm what we were all suspecting. Dylan suggested it was probably just echo effects from our own footsteps, but even he didn't sound convinced by his explanation. The sounds grew more distinct as we climbed higher. What had started as random branch snapping evolved into a rhythm that definitely suggested bipedal movement. There would be two distinct sounds in succession, like footsteps, followed by a pause, then two more sounds. The timing matched human walking pace, but the sounds themselves were wrong. They were too heavy, as if whatever was making them weighed much more than a normal person, or was deliberately stepping harder than necessary. Camden's pace had increased noticeably, and he was no longer stopping to carefully examine obstacles before navigating them. His urgency was infectious, and soon we were all moving faster than was safe on the uneven trail. Several times, one of us stumbled or nearly tripped, but we kept pushing upward, driven by a growing sense that we needed to reach the lookout point as quickly as possible. The temperature seemed to drop with each step we climbed, despite the physical exertion that should have warmed us up. The air felt thinner too, but we weren't at high enough elevation for that to make sense. Most disturbing of all, the familiar scents of the forest, pine, earth, decaying leaves, were being overwhelmed by something else. It was a musty, organic smell that reminded me of wet animal fur, but stronger and more unpleasant. When we were perhaps 10 minutes from the lookout point, Camden suddenly stopped so abruptly that Dylan nearly collided with him. "Did you guys hear that?" Camden whispered, his voice barely audible. We all strained to listen, and after a few seconds, we heard what had caught his attention. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in the forest, a low, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of us on the trail. It wasn't quite growling and wasn't quite breathing, but it had elements of both. The sound came in regular intervals, lasting about 3 seconds each time, with 5-second pauses between repetitions. We stood frozen on the trail, listening to this mysterious sound and trying to determine its source and distance. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lookout point, which meant whatever was making it was positioned between us and our destination. The logical response would have been to turn around and head back down the mountain, but teenage pride and curiosity overrode common sense. Dylan suggested we continue but move more carefully, staying alert for any signs of danger. Camden agreed, but I could see his hands shaking as he gripped his flashlight. Trevor and I exchanged glances that communicated our shared nervousness, but neither of us wanted to be the one to suggest retreat. We resumed climbing, but now every step felt like a move in a dangerous game where we didn't know the rules or understand the stakes. The final approach to the lookout point had always been the most rewarding part of our hike. The trail made one last steep climb through a gap in the rock face, then opened onto a natural stone platform that offered spectacular views of the Hudson River Valley below. On clear nights, you could see lights from towns 20 miles away, creating a glittering tapestry that made the challenging hike worthwhile. Tonight, as we approached that familiar gap in the rocks, everything felt wrong. The mysterious sound we'd been hearing had stopped about 5 minutes earlier, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Camden's flashlight beam revealed the familiar rock formation ahead, but the shadows seemed deeper and more ominous than they should have been. We reached the base of the final climb and paused to catch our breath and steel our nerves. The rock face that led to the lookout point was maybe 15 feet high, with natural handholds and ledges that made it an easy scramble during daylight. At night, it became a treacherous climb where a single misstep could result in a serious fall. Camden went first, his flashlight clamped between his teeth to free both hands for climbing. The beam created wild, swinging shadows as he moved, making it difficult for the rest of us to follow his progress. Dylan went next, then me, with Trevor bringing up the rear. The climb took several minutes, with each of us calling out warnings about loose rocks or tricky handholds. When I finally pulled myself over the edge onto the lookout platform, I was surprised by what I saw. Camden and Dylan were standing at the far edge of the platform, but they weren't looking out at the valley view. Instead, they were staring at something on the stone surface near their feet. Their body language suggested confusion and concern. "What is it?" I asked as I approached them, with Trevor climbing up behind me. Dylan pointed his flashlight at the ground, revealing what had caught their attention. The stone platform was covered with marks that looked like they'd been scratched or scraped into the rock surface. The marks formed rough patterns that might have been random, but seemed too deliberate to be natural weathering. The scratches were deep enough to be clearly visible on our flashlight beams, and they covered an area roughly 10 feet square in the center of the platform. Some of the marks looked recent, with sharp edges that hadn't been worn smooth by weather. Others appeared older, creating layers of scratching that suggested whatever had made them had been returning to this spot repeatedly over time. Trevor joined us and immediately noticed something we'd missed. "Look at this," he said, directing his flashlight to the edge of the platform. There, clearly visible in the dirt that had accumulated in cracks between the stones, were the same unusual footprint patterns we'd seen at the railroad tracks. But these were clearer and more defined, showing what definitely looked like foot shapes but with proportions that weren't quite human. The prints were longer than normal human feet and narrower. But most disturbing was the spacing between them. The stride length suggested something with much longer legs than any of us possessed. The depth of the impressions indicated significant weight, but the narrow shape suggested something lean rather than bulky. We stood in a tight group in the center of the platform, flashlights pointed downward at the evidence around us. The spectacular view that had drawn us here was forgotten, overshadowed by the growing realization that we weren't alone on this mountain. Something else used this lookout point, and based on the extensive markings, it had been coming here regularly. The wind had picked up since we'd reached the platform, creating a constant rustling in the trees below us and making it difficult to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats. Every few seconds, a particularly strong gust would cause branches to scrape against each other, producing sounds that could easily be mistaken for movement or voices. Camden was the first to suggest we should leave. "I don't like this," he said, stating what we were all feeling. Whatever made these marks might come back. Dylan agreed, and we began preparing for the descent, but as we gathered near the edge where we'd climbed up, Trevor made an observation that stopped us cold. "The footprints," he said, pointing his flashlight toward the climbing route. "They continue down the rocks. Whatever made them went down the same way we came up." He traced the beam along the stone surface, revealing clear impressions in the dirt and moss that covered the rock face. The prints led from the platform down toward the trail we just climbed. The implications were terrifying. If these tracks were recent, and if whatever made them had descended the same route we used to reach the lookout, then it might still be somewhere on the trail below us. Our route back to safety could be blocked by whatever creature had been using this place as its territory. We spent several minutes discussing options, but there really was only one choice. We had to go back down the same trail we used to reach the lookout point. The alternative was spending the night on the exposed platform, which none of us were prepared for. As frightening as the descent might be, staying put seemed even more dangerous. Dylan took the lead for the climb back down to the trail, with Camden following behind him. I went third, and Trevor brought up the rear. The descent was nerve-wracking, with every handhold and footstep requiring careful testing before committing our weight. The knowledge that something else had recently made this same climb added an extra layer of anxiety to an already challenging task. When we finally reached the trail level and regrouped, we made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of heading directly back down the mountain the same way we'd come up, we decided to take the longer route that branched off from the main trail about halfway down. This alternate path would add 15 minutes to our descent, but it would also take us away from whatever might be waiting on the direct route. The trail fork that would prove so significant to our night was located about halfway down the mountain, at a point where the main path was joined by an older, less maintained route that eventually merged back with the primary trail near the bottom. During our daytime hikes, we explored both branches and knew they were equally safe, though the alternate route was longer and more challenging. Our original plan had been simple. Camden would take the longer path alone as a final test of his courage and navigation skills, while the rest of us took the direct route back to the railroad tracks. We'd meet up at the bottom, complete Camden's initiation with congratulations and backslapping, then head home to celebrate another successful adventure. The plan seemed reasonable when we discussed it at Dylan's house, but now, after everything we experienced, it felt recklessly dangerous. However, Camden insisted on going through with the original plan. "I didn't come this far to chicken out now," he said, trying to project confidence despite the obvious fear in his voice. "Besides, if something is following the main trail, the alternate route might actually be safer." His logic was sound, but the idea of splitting up our group felt wrong given what we'd encountered. Dylan tried to convince him to stick with us, pointing out that the initiation was just a symbolic gesture and that he'd already proven his courage by leading us to the lookout point under such difficult conditions. But Camden was adamant, and eventually we agreed to proceed with the original plan, but with significant modifications for safety. We synchronized our watches and established check-in procedures. Camden would signal us with his flashlight every 5 minutes, and we would respond with our own lights to confirm visual contact. If anyone failed to make contact at the designated times, the other group would immediately come looking. We also agreed on emergency signals and established a rendezvous point at the bottom of the trail. The split in the trail was marked by a large boulder that served as a natural landmark. The main path continued straight, following the most direct route down the mountain. The alternate route branched off to the right, winding through denser forest before eventually curving back to rejoin the main trail. During daylight, both paths were clearly visible and well marked. At night, the alternate route disappeared into darkness within a few feet of the split. Camden checked his gear one final time, making sure his flashlight batteries were fresh and his phone was easily accessible. We reviewed the timing once more, confirmed the check-in signals, and wished him luck. He seemed nervous but determined as he headed into the trees, his flashlight beam quickly disappearing among the thick vegetation. Dylan, Trevor, and I continued down the main trail, but our progress was much slower than usual. Every few minutes, we stopped to watch for Camden's signal light, scanning the trees to our right where we knew his alternate route was running roughly parallel to our position. The first few check-ins went smoothly, with his light appearing right on schedule and our response signals acknowledging his safe progress. But as we descended further down the mountain, the terrain became more challenging and the distance between the two trails increased. By the fourth check-in, Camden's signal was barely visible through the dense forest, appearing as just a brief flicker of light that might have been imagination. We responded with our own signals, but we couldn't be sure he'd seen them. The main trail at this section was steep and rocky, requiring careful attention to foot placement and frequent use of trees and boulders for balance and support. Under normal circumstances, we would have been moving quickly and confidently, but tonight every shadow and sound demanded investigation. Our progress slowed to a cautious crawl that ate up precious time. When the fifth check-in time arrived, we stopped and waited, flashlights ready to respond to Camden's signal. 5 minutes passed with no sign of his light. We waited another 5 minutes, then began signaling frantically in hopes that our lights might attract his attention if he was having trouble seeing us. Still no response. Dylan made the decision to leave the main trail and try to locate Camden's alternate route. The forest between the two paths was thick and challenging, with no established trail to follow. We had to push through dense undergrowth and navigate around fallen trees and rock formations, all while trying to maintain our sense of direction. After 15 minutes of difficult bushwhacking, we found what we thought was Camden's trail, but there was no sign of recent passage. The path was overgrown and appeared to have been in use for months. Either we found the wrong route, or Camden had gotten lost and wandered off the trail entirely. Trevor suggested that Camden might have reached the bottom ahead of schedule and was waiting for us at the rendezvous point. It was possible he moved quickly down the alternate route and simply hadn't seen our signals due to the terrain. This optimistic scenario seemed increasingly unlikely as time passed, but it was better than considering the alternatives. We made our way back to the main trail and resumed our descent, moving as quickly as safety allowed. The need to find Camden and confirm his safety had become our primary concern, overriding the caution that had been guiding our movements earlier in the night. But as we approached the bottom of the mountain and the junction with the railroad tracks, a new fear began to take hold. What if whatever we'd been sensing on the mountain had found Camden on his solitary route? What if his failure to make the check-in signals wasn't due to equipment problems or navigation errors, but because something had prevented him from continuing his descent? We reached the railroad tracks in record time, our concern for Camden overriding the caution that had been governing our movements throughout the night. The familiar gravel bed and steel rails looked exactly as they had during our ascent, but the atmosphere felt different, more charged with tension and possibility. We immediately began searching for signs of Camden's arrival, but found no evidence that he'd reached the rendezvous point. Dylan called Camden's name several times, but kept his voice low, unwilling to announce our presence too loudly to whatever might be listening in the darkness. The calls echoed off the surrounding trees and faded into silence with no response. We tried his cell phone, but the calls went straight to voicemail, suggesting his phone was either turned off or out of battery. Trevor suggested we wait at the tracks for another 15 minutes before taking further action. Camden might have encountered difficulties on the alternate trail that delayed his arrival, or he might have taken a wrong turn and needed extra time to find his way back to the correct route. 15 minutes would give him a reasonable window to appear, while not delaying our own safety unnecessarily. We positioned ourselves on a large boulder beside the tracks, where we'd have a clear view in all directions and could easily spot Camden's flashlight when he emerged from the forest. The waiting was agony. Every sound from the surrounding woods could have been Camden approaching, or it could have been something else entirely. The darkness seemed to pulse with potential threats and false hopes. Halfway through our wait, we heard movement in the forest on the opposite side of the tracks from where we expected Camden to emerge. It was definitely the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, breaking branches and disturbing leaves in a way that suggested significant size and weight. We turned our flashlights toward the sound, but the beams couldn't penetrate the dense vegetation far enough to reveal the source. The movement continued for several minutes, following a path parallel to the railroad tracks but staying within the cover of the trees. Whatever was making the sound was deliberately avoiding the open area around the tracks, suggesting either animal wariness or something more calculated. The sounds were rhythmic and purposeful, definitely not the random movement of a deer or other common forest animal. As we strained to track the movement through the trees, Dylan suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed toward the trail opening where we expected Camden to appear. A figure was emerging from the forest, but even in the poor light, it was clear that something was wrong. The silhouette was human-sized but moved in a way that seemed unnatural, too fluid, with a gait that didn't match normal walking patterns. We trained our flashlights on the figure, but the distance and intervening vegetation made it impossible to make out clear details. What we could see was disturbing enough. The figure was tall and lean, with proportions that seemed slightly off, arms that hung too long, a posture that was too straight, movements that were too smooth and controlled. The figure paused at the edge of the clear area around the tracks, as if sensing our presence or evaluating the situation. For several long moments, it remained motionless, creating a standoff where neither side moved or made sound. The silence was broken only by the continuing movement in the forest on the opposite side of the tracks, suggesting that whatever we were seeing was not alone. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped backward into the forest and disappeared. The movement was so fluid and quick that it seemed almost like a magic trick. One moment it was visible, the next it was gone without any sound of retreat or continued movement through the underbrush. We sat in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. The figure had been roughly where Camden should have emerged from the alternate trail, but it definitely hadn't been Camden. The size, movement, and behavior were all wrong. The implications were terrifying. If this thing had come from Camden's route, what had happened to our friend? Dylan made the decision that probably saved our lives. "We're leaving," he announced, standing up from the boulder. "Right now. Camden will have to find his own way back." It seemed like abandonment, but the alternative, investigating further or waiting longer, felt increasingly dangerous. We began moving quickly along the railroad tracks toward the trail that would take us back to Dylan's house. But before we'd gone more than 100 yards, we heard Camden's voice calling our names from somewhere in the forest behind us. The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately tempered by confusion and new fear. Camden's voice was coming from the wrong direction, not from the trail where the figure had appeared, but from deeper in the forest on the far side of the tracks. How had he gotten there? And why did his voice sound strange, carrying an echo or distortion that made it seem unnatural? We stopped and called back to him, trying to guide him toward our location. But as we listened to his responses, something felt increasingly wrong. The voice was definitely Camden's, but the words were oddly phrased and the responses didn't quite match our questions. It was as if someone was imitating Camden's voice but didn't fully understand the context of our conversation. Trevor pointed out something that made our blood freeze. "Listen to the timing," he whispered. His voice and the movement in the forest aren't matching up. He was right. We could still hear something moving through the trees, but the sounds weren't coming from the same location as the voice calling our names. The realization hit us simultaneously. Whatever was calling to us in Camden's voice wasn't Camden. It was something else, something that had learned to mimic human speech but couldn't perfectly replicate human behavior. The real Camden was still missing, and something that shouldn't exist was trying to lure us deeper into the forest. We ran. The sprint back to Dylan's house was the longest 20 minutes of my life. We abandoned all pretense of stealth or caution, crashing through the forest with our flashlights sweeping wildly ahead of us, focused solely on putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and whatever we'd encountered at the railroad tracks. Behind us, Camden's voice continued calling our names, but the calls grew more distorted and less human with each repetition. The trail back through the forest seemed longer than usual, with familiar landmarks appearing in unexpected locations or not appearing at all. Several times we took wrong turns that led to dead ends or unfamiliar sections of forest, forcing us to backtrack and waste precious time. The disorientation was so complete that I began to wonder if the trails themselves had somehow changed, rearranged by whatever forces controlled this part of the mountain. Dylan led our panic retreat, using his superior knowledge of the area to navigate by instinct when the regular trail markers failed us. Trevor and I followed closely, occasionally stumbling over roots or rocks but maintaining our desperate pace. Our flashlight beams created a small bubble of visibility around us, but beyond that cone of light, the forest pressed in with malevolent presence. The sounds of pursuit were sporadic but unmistakable. Branches breaking, leaves rustling, and occasionally that voice that sounded like Camden but carried undertones that made it clear it was something else entirely. Whatever was following us was staying just out of sight, matching our pace but not attempting to close the distance. The psychological effect was more terrifying than direct confrontation would have been. When we finally reached the meadow that marked the halfway point of our return journey, we discovered that our ordeal was far from over. The open field that had felt so exposed during our outbound journey now felt like a trap. The tall grass provided cover for anything that might be stalking us, while leaving us visible to observation from the surrounding tree line. We paused at the edge of the meadow, breathing heavily and trying to gather courage for the crossing. The field looked different than it had earlier. The grass seemed taller and denser, moving in patterns that didn't match the wind direction. Dark patches throughout the field might have been shadows or might have been something else entirely. Dylan suggested we circle around the meadow rather than crossing directly, but that would add significant time to our journey and force us through unfamiliar terrain. Trevor argued for the direct route, pointing out that speed was more important than stealth at this point. I found myself unable to make a decision, paralyzed by the knowledge that either choice could lead to disaster. The decision was made for us when we heard the sound that had haunted us earlier in the evening, that low, rhythmic noise that wasn't quite growling and wasn't quite breathing. It was coming from the forest behind us, much closer than before. Whatever had been following us was preparing to emerge from the trees, and we were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. We ran across the meadow in a straight line, abandoning any pretense of tactical movement. The tall grass whipped against our legs and tangled around our feet, making each step a struggle. Our flashlights created crazy patterns of light and shadow as we ran, occasionally illuminating shapes in the grass that might have been rocks or logs or something worse. Halfway across the field, Trevor tripped and went down hard, his flashlight flying from his hand and disappearing into the grass. Dylan and I immediately stopped to help him, but in those few seconds of vulnerability, we heard something that nearly destroyed our remaining composure. The mimic voice of Camden was now coming from multiple directions, as if several sources were calling our names simultaneously. We found Trevor's flashlight and got him back on his feet, but he was limping badly from what was probably a sprained ankle. The final sprint to the forest edge took everything we had, with Dylan and I supporting Trevor between us while constantly checking over our shoulders for signs of pursuit. When we finally reached the continuation of the trail on the far side of the meadow, we allowed ourselves one brief moment of hope. We were almost back to Dylan's house, almost to safety and lights and locked doors. But as we entered the final section of Forest Trail, we made a discovery that crushed that hope immediately. Dylan's cell phone was missing. He had it when we reached the railroad tracks. I remembered him checking it when we were trying to call Camden. But now it was gone, dropped somewhere during our panicked retreat. Without that phone, his parents would be unable to reach him when they returned from their weekend trip. The consequences of losing it would be severe, but the thought of returning to search for it was unthinkable. Yet Dylan was adamant. "I have to go back," he said, his voice showing the strain of the night's events. "I can't afford to lose that phone. My parents will kill me, and we'll all get in trouble." Trevor and I tried to talk him out of it, pointing out the obvious dangers, but Dylan was determined. We reached a compromise that satisfied no one but seemed like the only viable option. Dylan would return to the meadow edge to search for his phone, while Trevor and I continued to the house in safety. We would keep trying to call the phone until Dylan could hear it ringing, then guide him to its location by voice. It was a terrible plan, but every alternative seemed worse. Dylan disappeared back into the forest, leaving Trevor and me to complete the final 10 minutes of trail to his house. Those 10 minutes felt like hours, with every shadow potentially concealing threat and every sound potentially signaling danger. When we finally emerged from the trees and saw the lights of Dylan's backyard, the relief was overwhelming. We made it to the pool area and immediately began calling Dylan's phone, listening for the sound of ringing that would help him locate it. After several attempts, the phone was answered, and we heard Dylan's voice reporting that he found it. But something in his tone was wrong, too calm, too controlled, lacking the relief and urgency we expected. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Dylan claiming he was on his way back but needing more time due to some unspecified difficulty with the trail. His responses to our questions were reasonable but somehow felt rehearsed, as if he was following a script rather than having a natural conversation. It was Trevor who first voiced the suspicion we were both feeling. "That's not Dylan," he said after we ended the call. "Something's wrong with his voice." I had noticed it too, subtle differences in inflection and phrasing that suggested we weren't talking to our friend at all. We tried calling back, but now the phone went straight to voicemail. We waited another 20 minutes, then tried again with the same result. Dylan never returned to the house that night. When his parents came home the next morning, we had to explain that he'd gone missing during a hiking trip and that we'd lost contact with him somewhere in the forest. The search and rescue operation lasted 3 days and involved dozens of volunteers, but no trace of Dylan was ever found. The official conclusion was that he'd gotten lost in the extensive forest system and either succumbed to exposure or fallen from one of the many cliff areas in the region. His body was never recovered. Camden was found 2 days later, nearly 10 miles from where we'd last seen him, sitting beside a rural highway with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He remembered starting down the alternate trail, but claimed his next clear memory was waking up beside the road with concerned motorists trying to help him. Medical examination revealed no physical injuries, but he displayed signs of severe psychological trauma and would never discuss what had happened during his missing time. Trevor and I kept our mouths shut about the supernatural elements of that night. Who would have believed us? Instead, we supported the official theory about getting lost and separated in unfamiliar terrain. But we both knew the truth was far stranger and more terrifying than anyone was prepared to accept. I still have nightmares about that night, dreams where I'm back in those dark woods listening to voices that sound like my friends but carry undertones of something inhuman. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear Dylan calling my name from somewhere outside my bedroom window. The rational part of my mind knows it's just trauma and guilt, but there's always that small part that wonders if something followed us back from the mountain. The trail behind Dylan's old house was closed permanently after 3 more hikers went missing over the following year. The official reason was unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife, but locals whispered about stranger explanations. The house itself sat empty for months before Dylan's family finally sold it to buyers from out of state who had no knowledge of its history. I never went night hiking again. Some experiences change you in fundamental ways, and that night in the Catskill Mountains taught me that there are things in this world that we're not meant to encounter. Sometimes the darkness that surrounds us isn't empty, sometimes it's full of things that are better left undiscovered. The guilt over Dylan's disappearance will stay with me forever. If we hadn't split up, if we hadn't let him go back for that phone, if we'd been braver or smarter or just made different choices, maybe he'd still be alive. But what if it's a dangerous game when you're dealing with forces beyond human understanding? Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some questions are too dangerous to ask. I tell this story not to entertain or frighten, but as a warning. The wilderness holds secrets that have been hidden for good reasons. If you find yourself in the deep woods at night and you start to sense that you're not alone, trust that instinct. If you hear voices calling your name from the darkness, don't assume they belong to friends. And if something seems wrong in ways you can't quite explain, don't ignore that feeling in the name of logic or bravery. Some things should be left alone in the darkness where they belong. Nine years ago, when I was 15, my family packed up our entire life and moved from the suburbs to a small mountain town in northwest North Carolina. The transition felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Our new house sat on 3 acres of partially cleared land, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the closest grocery store required a 20-minute drive down winding mountain roads. My parents, David and Susan, had grown tired of city life and wanted to give my younger brother Tommy and me a taste of rural living. Tommy was 11 at the time, still young enough to find adventure in catching fireflies and building forts, but old enough to understand that this move meant leaving behind friends and familiar places. For me, the isolation felt like freedom. No more crowded hallways at school, no more traffic noise at night, just the endless expanse of wilderness right outside our back door. The house itself was a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch that offered panoramic views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What captivated me most was how the forest seemed to press against our property line, as if nature was reclaiming its territory 1 inch at a time. Deer would graze in our backyard during dawn and dusk, and the calls of barn owls echoed through the darkness each night. Within our first week, we met Dan Carpenter, our nearest neighbor who lived down a gravel road that disappeared into the woods across from our driveway. Dan was a weathered man in his 60s with calloused hands and knowing eyes who had lived on his property for over 30 years. He owned nearly 200 acres of mixed hardwood and pine forest, land that had been in his family for generations. When he learned about my interest in hiking and the outdoors, he graciously offered to let me explore his property. "Just respect the land," he told me one evening as we stood on his front porch, watching the sun set behind the tree line. "These mountains have been here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. Treat them right, and they'll show you things most folks never get to see." The weight of his words settled over me like a promise. I had no idea how prophetic they would prove to be, or how the mountains would indeed show me something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. That first Saturday morning in October arrived crisp and clear, with frost coating the grass and our breath visible in the cool mountain air. The leaves had begun their spectacular transformation, painting the mountainsides in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. It was the kind of morning that demanded exploration, and I was determined to venture deeper into Dan's property than I had gone before. Convincing Tommy to join me took considerable effort. He preferred his video games and comic books to trudging through underbrush and climbing over fallen logs. But something in my enthusiasm must have been contagious because he eventually agreed, though not without extracting promises that we wouldn't stay out too long and that I would let him choose what we watched on television that evening. I packed my day pack with water bottles, granola bars, and my father's old binoculars. The weight of them around my neck felt reassuring, like carrying a piece of adult responsibility into the wilderness. I also grabbed my bright orange hunting cap, a precaution our father had drilled into us since hunting season had recently begun. The mountains during hunting season could be dangerous for anyone not wearing proper visibility gear. Tommy bundled himself in a thick fleece jacket and complained about the early hour, but I could see excitement building in his eyes as we walked down Dan's long gravel driveway. The stones crunched beneath our hiking boots, and the sound seemed amplified in the morning stillness. Dan was outside splitting wood when we arrived, his axe striking the logs with rhythmic precision that spoke of decades of practice. "You boys be careful out there," he called to us, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature. "Stay on the marked trails if you can, and if you see any hunters, make sure they see that orange hat of yours." We thanked him and set off toward the tree lane, where a well-worn path disappeared into the shadows of the forest. The trees seemed to swallow us whole once we left the clearing around Dan's house. Massive trunks rose like pillars supporting a living cathedral, their branches forming a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor. The path we followed was clearly maintained, probably used by Dan for accessing different parts of his property. But after about half a mile, we noticed a smaller, less obvious trail branching off to our left. This secondary path was narrow and partially overgrown, as if it hadn't been used regularly in some time. Something about its mysterious nature drew me like a magnet. "Come on," I told Tommy, adjusting the strap of my binoculars. "Let's see where this goes." Tommy hesitated, studying the dim pathway that wound between closely spaced pine trees. "Are you sure we should?" Dan said to stay on the marked trails. But my 15-year-old sense of adventure had already made the decision. I was already stepping onto the narrow path, pushing aside low-hanging branches and feeling the soft pine needles compress beneath my feet. Tommy, reluctant to be left alone, followed close behind. The unmarked trail proved more challenging than the main path we had abandoned. Fallen logs blocked our way at regular intervals, forcing us to climb over or crawl under obstacles that scratched at our jackets and caught on our pants. The forest grew denser as we progressed, with thick stands of pine trees creating a tunnel-like effect that seemed to muffle all sound except our own breathing and footsteps. 20 minutes into this detour, the character of the woods began to change. The well-maintained forest of Dan's property gave way to something wilder and more untamed. Underbrush grew thicker, and I noticed more dead trees standing like gray skeletons among the living ones. The very air felt different here, heavier somehow, with an underlying mustiness that suggested places where sunlight rarely penetrated. It was Tommy who first spotted the deer stand. "Look up there," he whispered, pointing toward a large oak tree about 50 yards ahead. The structure was clearly handmade, constructed from rough lumber and camouflaged with military surplus netting that had faded to a dull green-brown. It sat approximately 20 feet above the ground, accessible by wooden boards nailed directly into the tree trunk as a makeshift ladder. The stand looked recent enough to be functional, but something about it felt different from the hunting blinds I had seen on Dan's property. My curiosity overcame my caution. Despite Tommy's protests, I approached the base of the tree and began climbing the improvised ladder. The boards creaked under my weight, and I noticed that several were loose or partially rotted. When I finally reached the hunting platform, I found it empty except for an old plastic chair and some scattered cigarette butts. But it was the view from the stand that made my heart race. Through the trees, roughly 300 yards in the distance, I could make out the roof of a structure that definitely wasn't on any map of Dan's property. The building appeared to be constructed from a mixture of materials: metal roofing, wooden siding, and what looked like blue tarps covering sections where the original roof had failed. "What do you see?" Tommy called up from below, his voice tight with nervous energy. "There's a building out there," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Some kind of house or cabin." When I climbed down and described what I had seen, Tommy's face went pale. "Maybe we should go back," he suggested. "We don't know whose property that is, and we might be trespassing." But the rational part of my brain had been overwhelmed by adolescent curiosity. The presence of that mysterious structure felt like a puzzle that demanded solving. Against Tommy's better judgment, I convinced him to continue toward the building, arguing that we would just get close enough for a better look and then turn back. The decision would prove to be the most dangerous mistake of my young life. As we approached the mysterious structure, the forest around us seemed to grow more oppressive with each step. The trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form an almost impenetrable canopy that reduced the October afternoon to perpetual twilight. Our footsteps on the pine needle carpet seemed unnaturally loud, and I found myself wincing at every small sound we made. About 100 yards from our destination, we encountered an abandoned vehicle that stopped us both in our tracks. An old Jeep Cherokee sat at an odd angle beside the path, its front end pointed toward the trees as if the driver had simply pulled off the trail and walked away. The vehicle was ancient, probably from the late 1980s, and showed extensive rust damage along its wheel wells and door frames. All 4 tires were flat, and kudzu vines had begun climbing over the hood and windshield. What struck me most about the abandoned Jeep was how it had gotten to this remote location in the first place. We were now at least a mile from any road accessible to vehicles, and the narrow path we had followed would have been impossible for anything larger than an ATV to navigate. Yet here sat this full-sized SUV, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Tommy ran his hand along the vehicle's dusty side panel, leaving tracks in the accumulated grime. "This thing's been here for years," he observed, his voice barely above a whisper. Beyond the abandoned Jeep, the land rose sharply in a steep embankment that we had to scramble up on hands and knees, grabbing exposed roots and small saplings for handholds. The slope was treacherous with loose rocks and crumbling soil that gave way under our feet. When we finally reached the top, breathing hard from the exertion, we found ourselves face to face with what could only generously be called a house. The structure before us was a nightmare assemblage of mismatched materials and desperate repairs. The main building appeared to have started as a small cabin, but multiple additions had been cobbled together using salvaged lumber, metal sheeting, and blue plastic tarps. Windows were completely covered with layers of newspaper and duct tape, creating an impenetrable barrier that prevented any glimpse of the interior. The front door was likewise sealed, with what appeared to be a heavy screen door secured with multiple layers of silver tape. To one side of the main structure stood a rusted playground set that had clearly seen better decades. The swing set's chains hung at odd angles, some missing their seats entirely, while others supported swings that had rotted away to mere fragments of plastic and metal. A small slide, once painted bright red, had faded to the color of dried blood and was partially collapsed on one side. But it was the smell that truly unsettled me. A sharp, chemical odor hung in the air around the property, unlike anything I had encountered before. It wasn't the clean scent of pine trees or the earthy aroma of decomposing leaves that characterized the rest of the forest. This smell was harsh and synthetic, with an underlying sweetness that made my throat burn when I breathed too deeply. Tommy grabbed my arm, his fingernails digging into my jacket sleeve. "We need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Right now." But teenage curiosity had transformed into something approaching obsession. I had to know what was behind those newspaper-covered windows, what was causing that strange smell, and why someone had gone to such lengths to hide their activities in the middle of the wilderness. My decision to circle around to the back of the property would haunt me for years to come. Despite Tommy's increasingly frantic pleas to return home, I felt compelled to solve the mystery of this hidden compound. The rational part of my brain whispered warnings, but the overwhelming need to understand what I was seeing drowned out all caution. Behind the main structure, the scene became even more disturbing. A small travel trailer sat on blocks about 30 yards from the house, connected to it by a series of extension cords and garden hoses that snaked across the ground like mechanical veins. The trailer was old and weather-beaten, its aluminum siding streaked with rust stains and green mold. A thin column of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney pipe that had been crudely installed through the roof. Scattered around the trailer were dozens of blue plastic barrels, the 50-gallon drums used for storing chemicals or other industrial materials. Some were empty and lying on their sides, while others appeared to be full and were connected to an elaborate network of plastic tubing and hoses. The chemical smell that had been noticeable near the main house was overwhelming here, so strong that it made my eyes water and my throat burn. An old pickup truck, possibly from the 1970s, sat near the trailer with its tailgate down. The truck bed was filled with what appeared to be bags of fertilizer, boxes of cold medicine, and other materials I couldn't immediately identify. But even my 15-year-old mind was beginning to piece together the horrifying truth of what we had stumbled upon. This wasn't just someone's remote cabin or hunting camp. This was a drug manufacturing operation, specifically designed to be hidden from law enforcement in the most remote part of the mountains. The chemical smell, the barrels, the elaborate setup of hoses and equipment, everything pointed to the production of methamphetamine on an industrial scale. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Tommy and I weren't just trespassing on someone's property, we had wandered into the territory of dangerous criminals who would have every reason to ensure that witnesses to their operation never made it home to tell anyone what they had seen. I grabbed my binoculars and crept closer to the trailer, staying low behind the scattered barrels and equipment. Through the small windows, I could see the shadows of at least 2 people moving around inside. Their voices carried through the thin walls of the trailer, raised in what sounded like an argument about measurements and timing. My hands shook as I adjusted the focus on the binoculars, trying to get a clearer view of the operation. But it was at that moment that my bright orange hunting cap, the very safety precaution that was supposed to protect us in the woods, became the instrument of our near doom. A shout erupted from the trailer, followed by the sound of a door slamming open. Through my binoculars, I saw a large man emerge from the trailer, pointing directly at our hiding spot. He had seen the flash of orange through the trees, and our presence was no longer a secret. The man began yelling to someone inside the trailer, his words carrying clearly across the distance between us. "We got company." Kids with binoculars. The next few moments unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare. Tommy and I crouched behind the chemical barrels, frozen in terror as the implications of our discovery crashed over us like a wave. These weren't hunters or harmless mountain folk we had stumbled upon. These were criminals engaged in serious felonies who would view 2 teenage witnesses as an existential threat to their operation. A second man emerged from the trailer, and I could see both of them clearly now through my binoculars. The first was tall and heavy-set, with long, unkempt hair and a thick beard that had gone gray at the edges. He wore dirty overalls and heavy work boots, and his hands gestured wildly as he spoke to his companion. The second man was shorter but more wiry, with nervous energy that was visible even from our distant vantage point. What made my stomach drop to my feet was the sight of firearms. Both men were now armed, the tall one carrying what appeared to be a shotgun while his companion held a handgun. They were scanning the tree line methodically, clearly trying to locate exactly where we were hiding. "We have to run," I whispered to Tommy, my voice barely audible even to myself. "When I say go, we run back the way we came and we don't stop." But before I could give the signal, a new element entered the terrifying tableau. The sound of barking erupted from behind the trailer, deep and aggressive. The men were releasing a dog, a large one, from the sound of its bark. Through the binoculars, I watched the tall man attach a thick chain to what appeared to be a Rottweiler or similar breed, a muscular animal that strained against its restraint with obvious eagerness to pursue us. The psychological impact of seeing that dog was overwhelming. Tommy began to hyperventilate beside me, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. I realized that our situation had moved beyond mere danger into something approaching a life or death scenario. These men had the advantage of knowing the terrain, they were armed, and they had a tracking dog. We were just 2 kids who had wandered far from safety into a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond our control. The decision to run came when the dog's barking grew louder and I realized the men were moving in our direction. There was no more time for planning or strategy. I grabbed Tommy's hand and we bolted from our hiding place, crashing through the underbrush with abandon. Behind us, the shouting intensified as the men spotted our movement. The voices that followed us were filled with rage and desperation. I caught fragments of their threats carried on the mountain air, promises of what they would do if they caught us, crude descriptions of how they would ensure we never told anyone what we had seen. The words were meant to terrorize, and they succeeded completely. We ran through the forest with the kind of desperate speed that only comes from mortal fear. Branches whipped at our faces and clothes, rocks turned under our feet, and roots caught at our ankles. Behind us, the sound of the dog grew steadily closer, its barking now mixed with the crashing sounds of our pursuers moving through the underbrush. The terror of being hunted by armed men and their dog transformed every shadow in the forest into a potential hiding place and every sound into a harbinger of capture. My mind raced through possibilities as we fled, trying to remember every piece of wilderness survival knowledge I had ever absorbed from books, television shows, and conversations with experienced outdoorsmen. The key, I realized, was to break our scent trail and find concealment that would allow the search party to pass by us. Simply running would eventually lead to capture, the dog would track us relentlessly, and the men knew the terrain better than we did. We needed to disappear. About 200 yards from the drug operation, I spotted our salvation, a massive oak tree that had fallen years earlier, probably during a winter storm. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter and it created a natural barrier when it fell across a small depression in the forest floor. The space beneath the log was partially filled with accumulated leaves and debris, creating a hollow that could conceivably hide 2 small people. "This way," I hissed to Tommy, pulling him toward the fallen tree. We're going to hide under here." Tommy's eyes were wide with panic, but he followed my lead without question. I quickly explained my plan as we approached the log. He would crawl into the depression first, pressing himself as close to the trunk as possible, and I would lie in front of him, using my body to shield him from discovery. Then we would cover ourselves with leaves and debris and remain absolutely motionless until the search party passed by. The plan required splitting up, even briefly, and that terrified me almost as much as the approaching dog. But I knew it was our only chance. I sent Tommy to hide under the log while I ran toward a nearby creek, my bright orange hunting cap clutched in my hand. At the water's edge, I hurled the hat as far as I could toward the opposite bank, hoping it would create a false trail that would lead our pursuers away from our actual hiding place. When I returned to the fallen oak, Tommy was already concealed in the depression, his small body pressed against the massive trunk. I crawled in next to him, pulling armfuls of leaves and forest debris over both of us until we were completely covered. The smell of rotting vegetation filled my nostrils, and I had to consciously control my breathing to avoid coughing or making any sound that might give away our position. We lay there in the darkness beneath our makeshift camouflage, listening to the sounds of our pursuers growing steadily closer. The dog's barking became more excited as it picked up our scent trail, and I could hear the heavy footsteps of the two men crashing through the underbrush. Their voices were clearer now, filled with a mixture of anger and frustration. "They can't have gone far," one of them was saying. "Kids that age can't move through this terrain that fast." "The dog's got them," replied the other voice. "Look how excited he's getting. They went this way." The sound of their approach was terrifying in its methodical nature. These weren't panicked amateurs stumbling around in the woods. They were conducting a systematic search, following the dog's nose and using their knowledge of the terrain to anticipate where we might try to hide. When they passed within 30 yards of our hiding place, I could smell cigarette smoke and hear their heavy breathing from the exertion of moving through the dense forest. But then, miraculously, the sounds began to move away from us. The dog had picked up the scent trail leading toward the creek where I had thrown my orange hat, and our pursuers were following the false lead I had created. Their voices grew fainter as they moved in the wrong direction, buying us precious time to plan our escape. We remained hidden under the fallen oak for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes, listening as the sounds of our pursuers faded into the distance. When we could no longer hear any trace of the dogs barking or the men's voices, I carefully pushed aside our covering of leaves and debris and peered out into the forest around us. The woods had returned to their natural stillness, with only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a crow breaking the silence. But the peaceful atmosphere felt deceptive now, as if the forest itself had been contaminated by what we had witnessed. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every rustle of leaves might herald the return of our pursuers. "Are they gone?" Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse from fear and the effort of remaining silent for so long. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't certain of anything anymore. "But we need to get out of here right now, and we need to be smart about it." The journey back to Dan's property became an exercise in controlled paranoia. We moved through the forest like hunted animals, freezing at every unexpected sound and taking cover behind trees whenever we heard anything that might indicate human presence. What had been an adventurous hike into the wilderness that morning had transformed into a desperate escape from people who would have no hesitation about harming us to protect their criminal enterprise. My 15-year-old mind struggled to process the full implications of what we had discovered. The drug operation we had stumbled upon represented serious organized crime, the kind of activity that attracted violent criminals who viewed murder as simply another business expense. We weren't just witnesses to illegal activity, we were loose ends that needed to be eliminated. The physical demands of our escape were made worse by the psychological trauma of being hunted. Every muscle in my body ached from the sustained tension, and my throat burned from breathing heavily during our flight through the forest. Tommy was in even worse condition, stumbling frequently and requiring constant encouragement to keep moving. When we finally emerged from the tree line near Dan's property, both of us were scratched, dirty, and emotionally drained. Dan was working in his barn when he saw us approaching, and the expression on his face told me that our ordeal was written clearly in our appearance. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," he said, setting down his tools and walking toward us. "What happened out there?" The temptation to tell him everything was overwhelming. Dan was an adult, someone who would know how to handle the situation and protect us from the criminals we had encountered. But the irrational fear that dominated my thinking convinced me that talking about what we had seen would only make the situation worse. What if Dan didn't believe us? What if he told our parents and they forbade us from ever going into the woods again? What if the criminals somehow learned that we had talked? We just got turned around. I lied, hating myself for the deception but unable to see any alternative. Lost track of time and had to hurry back. Dan studied our faces for a long moment, clearly unconvinced by my explanation. But he didn't press the issue, instead offering to drive us home since we were obviously exhausted. We gratefully accepted the ride, spending the short trip in silence while my mind raced through the events of the day. The decision to keep our discovery secret would haunt me for years. Tommy and I made a pact that afternoon never to speak of what we had seen in the woods, a promise born from fear and the mistaken belief that silence would somehow protect us. We told ourselves that the criminals didn't know who we were or where we lived, that as long as we stayed away from that part of the forest, we would be safe. But the psychological impact of our encounter lingered long after the physical scratches healed. For months afterward, I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding from dreams of being chased through endless forests by armed men and vicious dogs. The woods that had once represented freedom and adventure now felt threatening and dangerous, filled with hidden perils that could destroy lives in an instant. It wasn't until years later, when I was in college and the memory had finally begun to lose some of its sharp edges, that I told my father about what Tommy and I had experienced that October afternoon. His reaction was a mixture of concern and relief, concern that we had been in such serious danger, and relief that we had somehow managed to escape unharmed. The land where we encountered the drug operation has since been purchased by developers and cleared for housing subdivision. Sometimes I wonder if the construction crews found any evidence of the criminal activity that once flourished in those remote woods, or if the forest simply reclaimed the site and erased all traces of what we had witnessed. The experience taught me that the wilderness, for all its beauty and majesty, can harbor dangers that have nothing to do with wild animals or natural hazards. The most dangerous predators in the mountains walk on two legs and have no connection to the natural world beyond their desire to exploit its remoteness for criminal purposes. I still love hiking and spending time outdoors, but I approach the wilderness with a different kind of respect now. The mountains showed me something that day that most people never see, a glimpse into the darker side of human nature and the realization that evil can flourish anywhere, even in the most beautiful and seemingly peaceful places on earth. The memory of that October afternoon serves as a permanent reminder that adventure always carries risk, and that sometimes the price of curiosity can be higher than anyone should have to pay. Tommy and I were lucky that day, lucky that we were smart enough to hide, lucky that our pursuers followed a false trail, and lucky that we made it home safely. Not everyone who stumbles upon such secrets in the wilderness is so fortunate. I spend most of my free time hiking through untamed wilderness, just me and the raw beauty of nature. There's something profoundly satisfying about being completely alone with the natural world, undisturbed, pure, authentic. When my wife Helen had to relocate for her new position at the regional medical center, she convinced me that our move would be perfect. A small cottage nestled on the outskirts of town, with direct access to thousands of acres of pristine forest just waiting to be explored. We never wanted children. Both of us were content with our 3 cats, Midnight, Whiskers, and Patches. They were our family, our responsibility, our joy. Moving with pets had always been a challenge, and I'm embarrassed to admit we'd left a trail of confused new homeowners across the country, each inheriting cats who simply refused to adapt to change. After nearly 4 weeks of unpacking and settling into our new place, I finally felt ready to tackle the wilderness that had been calling to me since we arrived. The morning of September 15, 2023, I woke before dawn with an excitement I hadn't felt in months. Ellen could see the anticipation radiating from me as I puttered around the kitchen, checking and rechecking my hiking gear. She watched with amusement as I organized my backpack for the third time, testing the weight distribution and ensuring every essential item was accounted for. "Water?" she asked, running through our usual pre-hike checklist. "2 full bottles plus purification tablets," I confirmed. "Food?" "Energy bars, trail mix, and a sandwich for lunch." "First aid kit?" "Bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, emergency whistle, everything's there." She nodded toward the locked cabinet in our bedroom. "What about protection?" I patted the holster on my left hip. The weight of the .38 revolver felt reassuring against my side. Ellen had never been comfortable with firearms, and I understood her concerns completely. But hiking alone in unfamiliar territory demanded certain precautions. Wild animals, dangerous terrain, potential encounters with unsavory individuals, the wilderness held beauty and peril in equal measure. "Weather forecast still looking good?" she asked, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. "Clear skies, mild temperatures, light winds. Perfect conditions." I turned in her embrace and smiled. "Don't worry, Ellen. This isn't my first adventure into the unknown." It was a small tradition between us, that reassuring phrase. Ellen had never shared my passion for hiking. She despised sweating, couldn't tolerate insects, and found extended walking tedious. I considered myself fortunate that my primary vice involved fresh air and exercise rather than alcohol, gambling, or expensive hobbies. Deep down, I suspected she hoped I'd eventually find a hiking companion in our new town, someone to share these expeditions so she wouldn't feel obligated to join me. After kissing Helen goodbye as she prepared for another demanding day at the medical center, I loaded my gear into our sedan and began the 40-minute drive to Cascade Ridge National Forest. The journey took me through winding country roads, past farmhouses and rolling hills that gradually gave way to dense woodland. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and crisper, carrying the rich scent of pine and earth. The parking area at the trailhead was nearly deserted when I arrived just after 8 a.m. A young family was setting up a picnic at one of the wooden tables near the restrooms, their 2 small children racing around the playground equipment with boundless energy. An elderly couple sat on a bench, sharing coffee from a thermos and pointing toward different mountain peaks visible in the distance. I methodically checked my gear one final time, adjusting straps and testing buckles. The visitor center sat adjacent to the parking area, a rustic log structure that blended seamlessly with the forest surroundings. A park ranger emerged from the building as I shouldered my pack, raising his hand in a friendly wave. "Beautiful morning for a hike," he called out, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. "Couldn't ask for better conditions," I agreed, approaching the information board mounted near the visitor center entrance. The display showed detailed trail maps with routes color-coded by difficulty level. Each trail listing included estimated hiking times, elevation changes, terrain descriptions, and notes about local wildlife. I photographed the entire board with my phone, zooming in to capture crucial details clearly. The ranger approached with a printed trail map, which I accepted gratefully. "First time visiting Cascade Ridge?" he inquired. "Just moved to the area. I've been eager to explore these mountains since we arrived." "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said warmly. "Sounds like you have some hiking experience?" "I've been doing this for about 8 years now. Started with day hikes and gradually worked up to multi-day backcountry trips." "Good to hear. Just remember to stick to the marked trails. We've had a few incidents this season with folks wandering off path and getting themselves turned around. The terrain can be deceptive, especially for newcomers." "Absolutely. I'll stay on the designated routes." "Have a safe hike," he said as I headed toward the trailhead. I selected the most challenging available route, the Ridgeline Trail, marked in black on the difficulty chart. The description promised steep ascents, rocky terrain, and spectacular panoramic views from the summit. The estimated round-trip time was 7 hours, which suited my plans perfectly. The trail would take me to an elevation of nearly 4,800 feet, offering breathtaking vistas of the valley and surrounding mountain ranges. The initial portion of the Ridgeline Trail wound gently through old-growth forest, following a well-maintained path marked with distinctive blue blazes painted on tree trunks every 50 yards. Towering pines and firs created a natural cathedral above me, their branches filtering the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft, springy surface that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. For what felt like hours, I pushed through the dense forest, marking trees and maintaining what I believed to be a straight course. The light never changed, remaining at that dim twilight level regardless of what the actual time might be. My watch showed different times each time I checked it, first 2:30 p.m., then 11:15 a.m., then 6:45 p.m. The digital display seemed to be malfunctioning as badly as my other navigation equipment. Exhaustion was beginning to affect my judgment. My water supply was half depleted, and I had consumed most of my food during the extended hiking. More concerning was the psychological impact of being lost in such an abnormal environment. The persistent silence was wearing on my nerves, making me jump at every small sound I created. As afternoon wore on, or what I assumed was afternoon based on my deteriorating sense of time, I began to notice changes in my surroundings that couldn't be explained by fatigue or stress. Trees that I was certain I had marked with my knife appeared unmarked when I encountered them again. Paths that had been blocked by fallen logs or dense brush seemed to open up my approach from different directions. Just as true desperation was beginning to set in, I stumbled into a large clearing that contained a sight both welcome and deeply unsettling, a log cabin surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with coils of razor wire. The structure appeared to be well maintained, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and warm light glowing through curtained windows. A generator hummed quietly somewhere behind the building, explaining the electric lights I could see. The fencing formed a perfect square approximately 100 yards on each side, with the cabin positioned in the center of the enclosed area. At each corner of the fence perimeter stood tall posts supporting powerful floodlights, currently switched off but obviously designed to illuminate the entire compound after dark. Multiple warning signs were attached to the fence at regular intervals. I approached close enough to read the signs. Most were official-looking metal placards, "No trespassing, private property, authorized personnel only," and warning, "electrified fence." But scattered among these official warnings were handmade signs that were far more disturbing. Pieces of cardboard and cloth bore messages scrawled in what looked like brown paint or dried blood: "Turn back now, they don't want you here," and most ominously, "Simply don't." The temperature had been dropping steadily since I entered the strange grove, and now I was genuinely cold. My breath was beginning to form visible clouds in the increasingly frigid air, despite the fact that it had been a warm September morning when I started hiking. Looking up at the sky through the clearing, I could see heavy gray clouds gathering overhead, and the first few snowflakes were beginning to fall. Snow in September at this elevation wasn't impossible, but the rapid weather change was extremely unusual. I had checked the extended forecast carefully before leaving home, and no precipitation had been predicted for at least a week. Yet here I was, watching snowfall steadily increase in intensity. My phone still showed no signal, but I could see that I had several unread messages from Helen. The timestamps made no sense. Some appeared to be from hours in the future, others from dates that hadn't occurred yet. One message from Helen was particularly confusing. "Where are you? You were supposed to be home 2 hours ago." I'm starting to worry. According to my planned schedule, I shouldn't even be starting my descent for another 2 hours. Either my watch was malfunctioning badly, or something very strange was happening with time itself in this place. The snowfall was becoming heavy enough to create a genuine survival situation. My hiking clothes were suitable for cool weather, but not for a snowstorm. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could feel the early stages of hypothermia beginning to affect my thinking and coordination. Despite the ominous warning signs, the cabin represented the only available shelter in a potentially life-threatening situation. I had to make a choice between following the posted warnings and risking death from exposure. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. I found what appeared to be the main gate in the fence, a heavy metal door secured with multiple locks and deadbolts. To my surprise, the gate was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently passed through without properly securing it behind them. The gap was just wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways. The moment I stepped inside the fence perimeter, several things became immediately apparent. First, the snow wasn't accumulating within the compound as heavily as it was outside the fence. Second, the air was noticeably warmer, creating an artificial microclimate around the cabin. Third, and most disturbing, I could see fresh footprints in the light snow, human footprints that led from the gate directly to the cabin's front door. Someone else was here, or had been here very recently. The cabin's front door stood slightly open, revealing a warm, inviting interior lit by kerosene lamps and the glow from a stone fireplace. The sound of wood crackling in the fire was clearly audible, and I could smell the distinctive scent of burning pine. After hours in the cold, silent forest, these normal domestic sounds and smells were incredibly appealing. "Hello?" I called out, loudly enough to be heard inside the cabin. "Is anyone there? I'm a hiker who got lost in the storm. I need shelter." No response came from within the building. I called out again, explaining my situation in more detail, but received only silence in return. The footprints I had observed led directly to the front door, but there were no corresponding tracks leading away from the cabin. Whoever had made those prints was presumably still inside. The snowstorm was intensifying rapidly, and the temperature continued to plummet. Ice crystals were beginning to form on my eyelashes and facial hair. My fingers were becoming numb despite my insulated gloves, and I could feel the early warning signs of frostbite in my toes. Staying outside much longer would result in serious cold weather injuries or death. I approached the cabin cautiously, my right hand resting on the grip of my holstered revolver. The weapon felt awkward in that position. I was left-handed and normally carried it on my left hip for a natural cross-draw. Somehow, I had apparently moved it to my right side without remembering doing so, probably during one of my many gear adjustments while lost in the forest. "I'm coming in," I announced loudly. "I don't mean any harm. I just need to get out of this weather." I pushed the door open slowly and stepped across the threshold into warmth and light. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a robust fire burning brightly. Comfortable furniture was arranged around the room, a leather couch, several wooden chairs, and a dining table set for 2 people. Kerosene lamps provided adequate lighting, and I could hear the steady hum of a generator somewhere outside. What immediately struck me as odd was how pristine everything appeared. The dining table was set with clean plates, glasses, and silverware, as if someone was expecting guests for dinner. 2 coffee cups sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, still steaming as if they had just been filled. A kettle whistled softly on a wood-burning stove in the corner. Yet there was absolutely no sign of human occupancy. No coats hanging by the door, no personal items visible anywhere, no indication that anyone actually lived in this place. It felt more like a movie set or a museum display than a real home. I called out again, more insistently this time. "I know someone is here. I saw your footprints in the snow. I'm not looking for trouble, I just need shelter until this storm passes." The only response was the continued crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of the kettle. I moved further into the room, examining my surroundings more carefully. The cabin was constructed of solid log walls with thick wooden beams supporting the ceiling. Heavy curtains covered the windows, blocking any view of the outside. A hallway led toward what appeared to be a bedroom and bathroom in the back of the structure. On the dining table, partially hidden under some papers, I noticed a large-scale topographic map of the local area. Red X marks had been drawn at various locations throughout the forest, connected by lines in what appeared to be some kind of pattern or route. My hiking trail was clearly marked, along with several other popular routes used by recreational hikers. More disturbing were the notes written in the margins of the map. In neat handwriting, someone had documented dates, times, and what appeared to be descriptions of hikers: male, 30s, red backpack, hiking alone, September 12th, female, blonde hair, with dog, September 8th, and dozens of similar entries going back several months. At the bottom of the map, in different handwriting that looked more hurried and desperate, someone had written, "They watch from the trees. Stay inside after dark. Don't trust the voices. The fence won't keep them out forever." I spent several minutes studying the map and its disturbing annotations, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The systematic recording of hiker information suggested some kind of surveillance operation, but for what purpose? The panic notes about watching eyes and voices implied something far more sinister than simple observation. My examination of the evidence was interrupted by a sound from outside, a low, rhythmic thumping like someone striking the side of a building with a heavy object. The sound came from the rear of the cabin, near where I had heard the generator running. I moved to the back window and carefully pulled aside the curtain to peer outside. The view through the window revealed the back portion of the fence compound. In the failing light and swirling snow, I could make out several dark shapes moving along the fence line. At first, I assumed they were deer or other wildlife seeking shelter from the storm. But as I watched more carefully, their movement patterns were wrong for animals. They moved in perfect coordination, maintaining equal spacing between each figure, and their shapes were too upright, too human-like. The thumping sound continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't random banging, it had the rhythm of a signal, like someone tapping out a code. As I watched, one of the figures near the fence raised what appeared to be a long stick or pole and struck the chain-link barrier. The metallic clang carried clearly through the storm, and I realized I had found the source of the rhythmic thumping. My blood pressure spiked as the implications of what I was seeing began to register. These weren't lost hikers seeking shelter. The coordinated movement, the deliberate signaling, the patient positioning around the compound, this was organized, purposeful behavior. I was not alone in this remote location, and whoever was outside had me surrounded. I let the curtain fall back into place and quickly moved away from the window. My mind raced through possible explanations and courses of action. The most rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation, perhaps researchers conducting some kind of wildlife study or park rangers investigating reports of illegal activities in the forest. But the evidence didn't support benign explanations. The disturbing map annotations, the abandoned feeling cabin with its too perfect domestic setup, the systematic surveillance of hikers, and now the coordinated presence of multiple figures outside the fence, everything pointed towards something far more threatening. I checked my phone again, hoping the electronic interference that had been blocking signals might have cleared. Still no service, and the device was displaying increasingly erratic behavior. The time jumped between different readings as I watched, and the battery indicator fluctuated wildly despite being fully charged when I left home. The thumping outside ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind and the crackling fire. In the sudden quiet, I became aware of another sound, soft footsteps moving around the exterior of the cabin. Not the heavy boots of hikers or workers, but something lighter, more stealthy. The footsteps circled the building slowly, pausing occasionally as if the walker was examining windows or doors. I drew my revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds loaded, with a speed loader in my pocket containing 6 more. 12 bullets against an unknown number of potential threats. The odds weren't encouraging, but at least I wasn't completely defenseless. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, controlled breathing like someone trying to remain perfectly quiet. The door handle began to turn with agonizing slowness, the metal mechanism creating barely audible clicks as it rotated. I took position behind the dining table, using it as cover while keeping my weapon trained on the entrance. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Years of target practice and hunter safety training had ingrained proper firearm handling into muscle memory. The door opened just a few inches, and I could see a shadow in the gap. "I'm armed," I announced clearly. "If you come through that door uninvited, I will defend myself." The shadow froze for several seconds, then the door slowly closed again. The breathing sound faded as whoever was outside moved away from the entrance. But I could still hear the soft footsteps circling the building, now joined by additional sets of footsteps. More figures had arrived, or others who had been watching silently had begun to move. Over the next hour, as darkness fell completely and the snowstorm continued to rage, the activity outside the cabin intensified dramatically. The soft footsteps had been joined by other sounds, voices whispering in the distance, the occasional metallic clang of someone testing the fence, and what sounded like equipment being moved or positioned around the compound. I had barricaded the front door using the dining table and one of the wooden chairs. The back door leading from the kitchen was secured with a heavy wooden beam that appeared to have been installed specifically for that purpose. All the curtains were drawn tight, preventing anyone outside from seeing in while also blocking my view of their activities. The kerosene lamps provided adequate light for moving around inside the cabin, but I kept them turned down low to avoid creating obvious shadows that might reveal my position to watchers outside. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to glowing coals, and I didn't dare add more wood for fear that the increased light might be visible through gaps in the curtains. My phone had finally stopped working entirely. The screen remained black no matter what buttons I pressed, and the device wouldn't respond to any attempts to restart it. My watch had also ceased functioning, leaving me with no way to track the passage of time except by observing the gradual dimming of the fire. As I explored the cabin more thoroughly, searching for additional weapons or tools that might be useful, I made several disturbing discoveries. In the bedroom, I found a journal hidden beneath the mattress. The entries, written in the same neat handwriting as the map annotations, documented months of observations. Day 47, 3 more hikers today. The watchers are becoming bolder, approaching the fence line during daylight hours. Changed the warning signs again, but people keep ignoring them. Day 52, found evidence of a camp about 2 miles north. Looked like someone had been there for several days before leaving suddenly. All their gear was abandoned, including a backpack with identification. Reported it to authorities, but they didn't seem concerned. Day 58, the pattern is becoming clear. They're drawn to isolated hikers, especially those who wander off the marked trails. The fence provides some protection, but not permanently. I need to find a way to get word to the outside world. Day 63, last entry. They're testing the fence systematically now, looking for weak points. The generator is running low on fuel, and I won't be able to make another supply run. If someone finds this journal, know that the forest itself has been compromised. Don't trust your equipment, don't trust your senses, and whatever you do, don't go into the trees alone after dark. The journal entries painted a picture of someone who had been living in the cabin for an extended period, studying the same phenomena that had trapped me. The references to watchers and they were ominously vague, but the fear and desperation in the later entries were unmistakable. In the kitchen, I found a radio, an old-fashioned analog unit that didn't rely on digital technology. When I turned it on, static filled the air, but by carefully adjusting the tuner, I was able to pick up fragments of broadcasts. Most were routine communications between park rangers, dispatchers, and emergency services, but one transmission made my heart race. Search and rescue operation initiated for missing hiker, vehicle located at Cascade Ridge Trailhead. Family reports he failed to return as scheduled, expanding search to include off-trail areas. They were looking for me. Alan had reported me missing when I failed to come home as planned. But how long had I been gone? The journal's final entry was dated 3 days ago, but that couldn't be right. I had only been hiking for 1 day. The radio crackled with another transmission. Day 3 of search operation, no trace of the missing hiker, weather conditions hampering search efforts, requesting additional personnel and equipment. Day 3? That was impossible. I had left home this morning, hiked for several hours, become lost in the strange grove, and found the cabin. Even accounting for disorientation and the confusing time displays on my malfunctioning devices, I couldn't have been missing for 3 days. But the evidence was mounting that something was seriously wrong with my perception of time and reality. The journal entries, the radio broadcasts, the systematic surveillance documented in the map annotations, everything suggested that this location existed outside the normal flow of time and natural law. Throughout the endless night, the sounds outside the cabin continued. Sometimes the activity seemed to intensify, with multiple voices whispering in the darkness and the steady rhythm of footsteps circling the building. Other times, everything fell silent for long periods, creating an oppressive quiet that was somehow more frightening than the obvious presence of watchers. I dozed fitfully in one of the wooden chairs, my revolver across my lap and my senses alert for any change in the situation. Every small sound, the settling of the logs in the fireplace, wind rattling a loose shutter, the distant hum of the generator, brought me instantly to full alertness. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through gaps in the curtains, the activity outside gradually diminished. The voices fell silent, the footsteps faded away, and an almost normal quiet settled over the compound. I waited another hour before carefully approaching one of the front windows and peering outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the storm clouds were breaking up to reveal patches of blue sky. The compound looked completely normal in the morning light, no footprints in the snow, no evidence of the night's activities, no sign that anyone had been present except for my own tracks leading from the gate to the cabin door. I remember every detail from that autumn day in 1987 when I was 11 years old, but I wish I could forget. The memory surfaces at the most unexpected moments, triggered by the smallest things. Just last Tuesday, while driving through the Riverside Tunnel on my way to pick up groceries for dinner, my car radio cut to static. That familiar white noise filled the vehicle, and suddenly I was transported back 36 years to a day that changed everything I thought I knew about reality. The static in that tunnel wasn't just any ordinary interference. It carried the same metallic undertone, the same irregular crackling pattern that had emerged from my walkie-talkie all those years ago. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the warm October evening. The grocery run could wait. I pulled over at the first exit and sat in a gas station parking lot, trying to slow my racing heartbeat. You see, I used to be an avid outdoorsman. As a child, I spent every possible moment exploring the dense woodlands behind our family property. Those forests were my sanctuary, my playground, my whole world. But after what happened that October afternoon in 1987, I found excuses to stay indoors. Even now, as a 47-year-old man with a mortgage and responsibilities, I avoid hiking trails and camping trips. My wife thinks it's because I've grown soft with age and office work. She has no idea about the real reason. The woods behind my childhood home stretched for miles, connecting to state forest land that seemed to go on forever. My family owned 12 acres of it, and beyond our property line lay thousands more acres of untamed wilderness. Pine trees towered overhead like ancient guardians, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight even at midday. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft, silent surface that muffled every footstep. On quiet days, you could hear your own breathing echo in the spaces between the trees. I had been exploring those woods since I was 7, always with my best friend Vincent. We had been inseparable since kindergarten, two kids who shared an obsession with military tactics and survival stories. Our parents thought it was just a phase, harmless boyhood games that would pass with time. They had no way of knowing that our make-believe adventures would lead us into something that defied explanation. That particular Saturday started like any other autumn weekend. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and crimson, creating a canopy so beautiful it looked like something from a postcard. Vincent had slept over the night before, and we woke up early, eager to continue our ongoing military simulation game. We had spent weeks preparing for this mission, gathering equipment and planning our strategy with the seriousness of actual soldiers. Our gear was impressive for two 11-year-olds. We each carried military surplus backpacks filled with supplies, energy bars, water bottles, first aid kits, and compass. Vincent's older brother had given us a pair of Motorola walkie-talkies for Christmas, the kind with a 3-mile range and crystal clear reception. We wore camouflage clothing purchased from the local army surplus store, complete with face paint that made us feel like real commandos. The plan was simple. I would venture deep into the woods and establish a hidden position while Vincent attempted to track and capture me. We had played variations of this game dozens of times, but never this far from the house. Today, we decided to push deeper into the forest than we had ever gone before, into sections where the trees grew so thick that the canopy blocked out the sky completely. My mother packed us a lunch and reminded us to stay together, to check in every hour using the walkie-talkies, and to be back before dark. She had always been protective, but she trusted Vincent and me to look out for each other. We had never given her reason to worry before. We promised to be careful and headed out through the back door, military packs bouncing on our shoulders as we jogged toward the tree line. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and pine sap. Squirrels chattered in the branches above us, and in the distance, we could hear the sound of a woodpecker working on a dead oak tree. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. There was no indication that this day would be any different from the countless others we had spent playing in these woods. Vincent and I reviewed our strategy one final time at the edge of the forest. I would have a 15-minute head start to find a hiding spot and radio my position using coded language we had developed. Then Vincent would begin his hunt, trying to locate and capture me before sunset. The rules were clear: stay within a half-mile radius of the house, check in every 30 minutes, and abort the mission if either of us felt unsafe. We synchronized our watches, tested our radios one last time, and clasped hands in our secret handshake. "Good hunting," Vincent said with a grin. "You too," I replied, already planning my route into the deepest part of the woods. I ran through the forest with the confidence of someone who knew every tree, every rock, every hidden path. The woods had been my second home for years, and I could navigate them blindfolded. But as I pushed deeper than ever before, the familiar landscape began to change. The trees grew larger and closer together, their trunks so thick that it would take 3 people holding hands to encircle them. The canopy overhead became denser, filtering the afternoon sunlight into thin, ghostly beams that barely illuminated the forest floor. The silence was the first thing I noticed. In the outer sections of the woods, there was always sound: birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals rustling through the underbrush. But here, in this deeper section, an oppressive quiet hung in the air like a heavy blanket. Even my footsteps seemed muted, absorbed by the thick carpet of pine needles beneath my feet. I found the perfect hiding spot, a massive oak tree with low-hanging branches that formed a natural ladder. The tree was ancient, its trunk scarred with decades of weather and animal marks. I climbed 20 feet up and settled onto a thick branch that was easily wide enough to support my weight. From this vantage point, I could see in all directions while remaining completely hidden behind the oak's broad trunk. The view from up there was both beautiful and unsettling. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, an unbroken sea of green and brown that seemed to swallow the horizon. I had never realized just how vast these woods were, how easy it would be to become completely lost in their depths. For the first time, I felt small and vulnerable, like a tiny speck in an enormous, indifferent wilderness. I had spent years learning the layout of these woods, memorizing landmarks and creating mental maps of every trail and stream. But now, in my panicked state, everything looked different. The trees seemed to have shifted positions, the paths appeared to lead in directions they never had before. What should have been a 15-minute jog back to the house became a desperate, disorienting flight through an increasingly unfamiliar landscape. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I pushed through thick clusters of undergrowth that I didn't remember encountering on my way in. Thorns tore at my clothing and skin, but the pain barely registered through my overwhelming need to escape. The forest seemed to be actively working against me, branches catching my backpack, roots trying to trip my feet, low-hanging limbs slapping at my face as I ran. I stumbled into a small clearing I had never seen before, my lungs burning from exertion and fear. This couldn't be right. I knew every inch of these woods, had explored them countless times over the past 4 years. There was no clearing in this direction, no open space that matched what I was seeing. But there it was, a perfect circle of grass surrounded by towering pines, as if someone had carved it out of the forest with surgical precision. The rawness of it made my skin crawl. Everything about the clearing felt artificial, unnatural, like a stage set designed to look like a forest but lacking some essential quality that would make it real. The grass was too green, too uniform. The circle was too perfect, too symmetrical. Even the way the sunlight fell through the canopy seemed strange, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied the sun's actual position in the sky. I forced myself to keep moving, to push through my confusion and fear. Home was somewhere behind me, or ahead of me, or to my left. I was no longer certain of anything. The familiar landmarks that had guided me through these woods for years were nowhere to be seen. It was as if I had somehow stepped into a parallel version of the forest, one that looked similar but was fundamentally different in ways I couldn't quite identify. My watch showed that I had been running for over an hour, far longer than it should have taken to reach the house from my hiding spot. This was impossible. The distance from my oak tree to our back door was less than half a mile. I could cover that ground in 15 minutes even at a casual walk. But according to my watch, I had been lost in the woods for more than 3 hours since starting my escape. When I finally burst through the tree line into our backyard, the sun was much lower in the sky than it should have been. The golden light of late afternoon slanted across the grass, creating long shadows that indicated evening was approaching. This couldn't be right. According to my calculations, it should still be mid-afternoon, barely past the time when Vincent would have started hunting for me. But there he was, standing in our backyard with my parents, all three of them turning toward me with expressions of relief and concern. My mother immediately ran to me, wrapping me in a hug so tight I could barely breathe. My father was on the phone with someone, speaking in the calm but urgent tone he used during emergencies. Behind them, I could see a police cruiser parked in our driveway, its red and blue lights creating a surreal light show against the approaching dusk. "Where have you been?" my mother demanded, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been looking for you for hours." Vincent came back and said you never responded to his radio calls. "We thought something terrible had happened." I stared at her in confusion, then looked at Vincent, who was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed and a strange expression on his face. He looked scared, but there was something else there too, something that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. "I was only gone for a little while," I protested, though even as I said it, I could see from their faces that this wasn't true. "I was hiding in the oak tree, waiting for Vincent to find me. The radio started making weird noises, and then I came straight home." My father finished his phone call and approached me with the measured steps of someone trying to remain calm in a crisis. "Son, you've been missing for over 4 hours. Vincent came back 3 hours ago saying he couldn't reach you on the radio. We've had police and volunteers searching the woods for you." 4 hours. The number hit me like a physical blow. I looked down at my watch, which clearly showed that exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes had passed since I first climbed the oak tree. But those hours felt like minutes in my memory. There was no way I had been in the woods that long. No way I had spent more than an hour running home through familiar terrain. The police officer approached and asked me a series of questions. Where had I been? Had I fallen and hit my head? Had I seen anyone else in the woods? Did I remember how I had gotten lost? I answered as honestly as I could, but my responses only seemed to deepen their concern. How could I have been lost in woods I knew better than my own bedroom? How could I have lost track of time so completely? Vincent remained unusually quiet during the questioning, responding only when directly asked about his side of the story. He confirmed that he had tried repeatedly to contact me on the radio but had received no response. After an hour of failed attempts, he had returned to the house and alerted my parents. The police officer seemed satisfied with our explanations and left after reminding us to stay together and check in more frequently during future adventures. That night, after my parents had finished their lecture about safety and responsibility, Vincent and I sat in my bedroom trying to make sense of what had happened. But every time I tried to discuss the strange radio static or the lost time, Vincent would change the subject or claim he didn't remember details clearly. His behavior was oddly evasive, and for the first time since kindergarten, I felt like my best friend was keeping secrets from me. It wasn't until a week later that Vincent finally told me what had really happened during those missing hours. We were sitting in his treehouse, sharing a bag of Halloween candy we had bought with our allowance money. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and the afternoon sunlight filtered through the orange and red leaves surrounding us. It should have been a perfect moment of childhood friendship, but Vincent's confession turned it into something much darker. "I need to tell you something about that day in the woods," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I didn't tell your parents or the police. Something I didn't want to tell you, but I can't stop thinking about it. Part of me wants to go back, to hike deep into those woods and search for answers to questions that have haunted me for decades. I've told myself that as an adult, armed with modern technology and a lifetime of experience, I could finally solve the mystery of that October day. But every time I consider actually doing it, I remember Vincent's description of those black eyes and that too-wide smile, and I find reasons to stay away. My own children are young now, 8 and 10 years old, with the same sense of adventure that Vincent and I once possessed. They love to explore and play outside, to build forts and create elaborate games of imagination. But I've made sure we live in a subdivision with small, manageable yards and no access to deep wilderness. I tell my wife it's for safety reasons, that children today face too many dangers to be allowed to roam freely. She agrees, never suspecting that my real fear isn't human predators or natural hazards, but something far stranger and more troubling. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and my family is asleep, I take out my old walkie-talkie and turn it on. I've kept it all these years, though I'm not sure why. The battery compartment is corroded now, and the antenna is bent from decades of storage in various closets and basement boxes. But occasionally, when the mood strikes me and my curiosity overcomes my fear, I switch it to that old channel and listen to the static. Most of the time, it's just normal radio interference, the familiar white noise of empty frequencies and distant transmissions. But sometimes, very rarely, I hear something else mixed in with the static. It's so faint that I can never be certain it's really there, so brief that it might just be my imagination playing tricks on me. But it sounds like breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic breathing that reminds me of that terrible sound I heard 36 years ago in the depths of the forest. When that happens, I quickly turn off the radio and try to convince myself it was just coincidence, just the normal quirks of old electronics and atmospheric interference. But deep down, I know better. Deep down, I know that whatever was in those woods that day is still out there, still waiting, still watching. And someday, when my curiosity finally overcomes my fear, I'm going to have to go back and face it.